Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by a very colourful cast of characters for one of the episodes that I've been most excited to do for quite some time. I'm joined, first of all, by Padraig Coyle.
Good evening, Rory. Thank you very much for your interest in the Belfast Celtic Society. I am the chair of the Historical Society based here in the city.
Perfect. And Padraig, thank you very much. I'm also joined by Frank Hennessey.
Good evening, Rory. It's nice to meet you. And I'm the treasurer of the society. And like my fellow members, we're very interested in preserving the history of our fantastic team that it was.
It's good to have you on, Frank, and it's a delight to meet you as well. And we also are joined by Charlie Tully. Charlie, how are you tonight?
Yes, I'm great, Rory. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for your interest in our incredible football club. I'm also president of the Belfast Celtic Society, a very proud president, and of course son of Charles Patrick Tully, one of Belfast Celtic's greatest players.
Absolutely. Joined by such esteemed characters this evening, esteemed guests for this episode. We are going to be talking about Belfast Celtic, who are a club from Ireland, who went defunct in, I think it was the 60s or the late 50s. But the story of Belfast Celtic is a little more than just a club that fell on hard times and had to fold or were wound up. And that's very much what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be discussing Belfast Celtic, the history of the club, the heritage of the club, and the people that they represented, the story behind their ultimate demise, and of course what the Belfast Celtic Society does today in order to preserve their history and heritage. But first of all, just before we begin, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the Belfast Celtic Society does?
Well, I suppose I could pick up that baton, Rory. The society has been running for 20, 21 years or so. And really, it was formed off the back of the publication of a book that I wrote in 1999 called Paradise Lost and Found, the story of Belfast Celtic. And the importance of that book in a way was because I managed to interview many of the old players who were still alive in those days. And I managed to get from them first-hand accounts of what it was like to play for the club, the circumstances in which the club left the league in 1949, actually, which is a long, long time ago, and how, because of their absence from the Irish League, there was a huge void when it came to supporting Irish League football, certainly from the west of the city. And in many ways, that coincided with the rise in support of fans from here travelling to Glasgow to watch Glasgow Celtic. And, what better draw to bring them to Glasgow than a certain Charles Patrick Tully. But in the early 2000s, we decided to form a society that could do what it could to keep alive the story of the club and somehow collect what items we could. And we have our own little museum at the Park Centre in Belfast, which formerly was the Belfast Celtic Ground, which was known locally as Paradise.
Exactly, and it's a great thing that you guys are doing because you've taken the memory of this club from all these kind of little scattered elements across Ireland and Scotland and really brought them together as a place of memorial, a place of remembrance, and a place to preserve the memory and the story of Belfast Celtic, which is magnificent. And at the end of the day, this is what football heritage is and should be. It should be something that people can come and enjoy, something that people can trace their roots to as well, and find a place that, maybe their grandparents went to or their family members went to. And, it's that kind of sense of history and heritage that I feel like can really enrich people's experience of football and how we consume it as well. And of course, as you mentioned there, Belfast Celtic also had this intrinsic connection with Glasgow Celtic over here in Scotland, and a number of other smaller Irish diaspora clubs as well. And Charles Patrick Tully was just one of those connections. And in fact, when the club was founded in 1891, at the time, they were just simply known as Celtic, which really just goes to show how strong that connection was. I mean, that's only 3 years after Celtic and Glasgow founded as well.
Yes, and it should be remembered that when the Belfast Celtic Club was formed initially from 3 or 4 local clubs getting together and coming up with a name, they wrote to their Glasgow cousins who sent them £10 as a donation to help them, get started. And I don't know what they exchanged value would have been back then, but £10 was a lot of money, and it was a gift that the Belfast club never forgot, and certainly it the bonds between the two were formed then, and they were never broken.
I think that's probably our best place to start, is right back at the very beginning when the club was founded in 1891, and just talk a little bit about the history of the club. Of course, that's a very important aspect of what we do as well. It's talking about what the club actually achieved and what it managed to do through the years. And I think one of my favourite things about Belfast Celtic is it's not just about the trophies, it's about who the fans were and who the club stood for as well, particularly through what was an incredibly turbulent and violent period of Ireland's history.
Yes, I think, Charlie, I'll leave it to you, because certainly given that your dad was from West Belfast, I mean, he grew up fairly close to the ground.
Yeah, there's no doubt about this. And I think just continuing on from the initial connection with Glasgow Celtic, I think it's fair to say that the businessmen that formed Belfast Celtic wanted to basically copy to a certain extent the ethos of Glasgow Celtic, with Brother Walford in the form of being really for the local community, to do charitable deeds, to be really of good standing, and to give the community something to basically own or buy into. So I think they used Glasgow Celtic as a little bit of a model, and that relationship, as you quite rightly said, developed over the years. From my dad's personal perspective, so he was born 11th of July 1924, McDonald Street, the Lower Falls, an area of incredible social and economic deprivation of the time. He was born into a large family, one of 7 footballing brothers. He was 15 years of age when he signed for Belfast Celtic, and obviously played football at school, was an outgoing sort of lad, great personality. I can only imagine, the deprivation that would have been of that era, from the point of view of massive unemployment, poverty, genuine poverty, and really not an awful lot to kind of aspire to or look up to. I think that would have been the background at the time of the formation of the club, and indeed through its early years.
Could I just add a bit of a counterpoint to that? If we look at Charlie Senior's career, he would have started playing, I think, about 1939, which would have been a particular period in world history, with the Great Wall Street crash, the Great Depression. That wasn't something that we escaped in Belfast. The shipyard, which at one point had 15,000 men, in the 1930s had shrunk to less than 1,500. And yet, by the time Charlie Senior started to play, they then had, looking to war in 39-40, the shipyard then again had expanded to something like 15,000 and so on as it developed over the post-war period. But if I could just go back in terms of the history of the club, I mean, the club's life spanned so many historical periods of what has been a less than happy time in Northern Ireland. First of all, 1891 was the year of the death of Parnell. Politics is very much inextricably linked with what happened in Belfast over that period. And Parnell, of course, was the man who created the Unionist Party in response to his activities. But the people who were involved in the club, and picking up what Charlie was saying about being a club being a model, drawing from Glasgow, there are so many parallels. And one of them I would highlight is the foundation of Belfast Celtic as a company, because going back that period, you can see a direct parallel with Fergus McCann in what they were doing. The Articles of Association of the club were ultra-democratic. As we all know what Fergus McCann said he was going to do with the club when he came in, and then he handed it back again to the fans. Mm. Belfast Celtic, 100 years earlier when it was founded, they set up the club as a company, but based on a very egalitarian voting system. The first 15 shares that you had, it was 1 share, 1 vote. From 15 to 25, you got another 2 votes for each block of 5 that you owned. From 55, you got 1 extra vote for every 10 shares. And then from 55 up to 100, it was an extra vote for every 15 shares. So what you had is a situation, someone could own about 100 shares, but be outvoted by 3 guys who had between them maybe 22 votes. It was ultra-democratic, and it was everybody in the community contributed towards those shares. And it was designed that nobody could control it. It was that the members could control the direction of the club. And so, as I say, the ethos was very much ingrained in the club from when it was set up. I'm acutely aware of that because my grandfather was chairman from that period until he died in 1922. But behind a lot of these things, you see the parallel, as I say, with our sister club in Glasgow.
And in 1904, when the club won its first charity shield, the club donated £100 to a local hospital, and there again, £100 would have been quite a tidy sum for use, for those in need in Belfast.
That's a significant amount of money.
Oh, absolutely, and Frank is referring to the memorandum of association and the rules and how the club wanted to be seen to operate, and it's in its own words there to provide for the welfare of persons of employment of the company, and that it would be there to help widows and children of such persons and other dependents upon them, granting money or pensions, providing schools, reading rooms, places of recreation, subscribing to the sick and those in need, hospitals, associations, societies, and others that the company shall think fit. And throughout their history, Rory, they were quite happy to play as many charity matches as were necessary for players who were injured. They frequently played their great rivals Linfield several times, maybe for injured players who'd played for them or for Linfield. They helped raise money for orphanages. They helped raise funds for orange bands. They would help because it was reciprocated by other clubs as well.
Exactly. And it's one of these nuances of football in its sort of fledgling years is that clubs who historically we know today as great rivals, with there being a lot of passion and underlying nastiness, back then they would have played charity matches with each other and raised funds for each other and helped each other out. And Celtic and Rangers played a number of friendlies, of course, but Celtic also played a number of friendlies with other clubs which represented the Irish community in Scotland, such as Carfin Shamrock, Dundee Hibernian before they became Dundee United. And just to go back to what Frank said there as well, during this period of Irish history, which was very turbulent, one of our episodes we done recently was on the history of the Edinburgh Derby and, of course, Hibernian. They were rocked massively by the political issues that were going on in Ireland at the time, to the point where the Hibernian name was almost taken off them by an owner who didn't want them associated with Ireland, which is obviously completely nuts to us now looking back on it, but it is a sliding doors moment in football history. And I think obviously over here the perception of Irish people was completely different. In fact, it was downright atrocious, and many Irish people were treated abhorrently during that period of time due to the Irish Wars of Independence and the other political turmoil which was ongoing. But of course, a number of the supporters of Belfast Celtic would have been under that same turmoil, and they would have had those same opinions thrown at them, and ultimately those are the people that the club represented the most.
Could I just pick up on one other aspect of it? When we look at the IFA, the Irish Football Association, that, unlike you think of the other sports, the obvious one being rugby and so on, the All-Ireland sports, and that reflects a reality which is a counterpoint to what Charlie was saying a minute ago, which, of course, when the club was founded, Belfast was a very prosperous city.
Absolutely.
Football was dominated in Ireland in the north because the wealth was in the north. The shipbuilding, 1 in 4 of every ship built in the UK was built in Belfast. So there was the wealth, there was the fans, the support, which is why you look at the history of any football cup or league, there were no southern teams. Bohemian was won once before the partition because the wealth was there to buy the players, to support them, pay them, train them, and so on. So that also was an element in the life of the supporters and the football, and explains why, when we look at it politically, which was going to be easier, to unite Ireland or to have a unified football team, which will come first. But the first thing about to bear in mind is it was a wealthy area, and there was wealth to generate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a really important point. There was wealth to be generated is actually a very, very good way of putting it. That, you know, although many of these people were struggling and did come from poverty within football, and even back then, though it was still a fledgling sport, it was still a lot of money. And to these people, this would have been a lot of money. So you're absolutely spot on. There was wealth there to be generated. But it didn't take very long for Belfast Celtic to I mean, they hit the ground running pretty much, because only 9 years after founding, they managed to win their first league title. Considering, I mean, just 9 years after founding, for a small club playing charity matches to go and do that, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, and just to go back, just to kind of reinforce something that Frank was saying, he mentioned clubs from the south. Shelbourne came second in the Irish League in 1906, 1907. And I mean, just looking at the league tables from then, there was no other team from the south got that near to winning the title. Most of the times they were close to the bottom of the table. So Frank is right. You know, we have to remember that in those days, Belfast was one of the world's major industrial cities, and it had a lot of power. There was a lot of money, and football was the sport. It provided entertainment for people who had pretty awful jobs, worked very long hours, and perhaps the only way they could let off steam was when they got to face their rivals every weekend, and hence you had this huge tension between the clubs. But yet, off the park, the players knew each other, they got on okay. It suited the purposes of both clubs to have this intense rivalry, because what else was there? There wasn't Sky Sports, there wasn't blanket football on television. You just heard it from what your mates told you if they'd been to the game, or if you managed to get to a match yourself. So, that all added to the intensity of this, this gathering every weekend and midweek too.
The working week would have been 45 hours. They would have been working on the Saturday morning.
Morning, yeah. And Wednesday afternoons off.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I like that point that you made, though, is that obviously people often forget, and it comes back quite nicely, actually. One of our members, Dave Proudlove, has just this week, at the time of recording, released a book called Work and Play, The Industrial Roots of English Football, which of course talks about works teams from England, but also discusses the importance of industry to football. And it's like what you said there, from the shipyards in Govan, the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, to Newcastle, Dundee, Birmingham, everywhere where there was industry, there was a pioneering football team who went on to dominate in the early years of football. And it's not a coincidence, and it would have been the exact same as well. And with that, there is money tied up in it.
Yeah, and I think also, certainly I think Charlie would concur with this, that, back in those days, footballers were just like everybody else who went to the game. They didn't arrive in a stretch limo wearing headphones the size of melons. That they went to... football was a job for them. They went to the game on the tram, or they got the train. Certainly in Celtic's case, the players were provided with train tickets if they were travelling in from outside of Belfast. So they were just like everybody else. So they were approachable. They lived next door to you. They weren't living in mansions.
Yeah, you can imagine, as I know would have been the case with my dad, living locally and playing literally on his doorstep at Celtic Park in Belfast. You would meet him walking about the street. You could stop up and have a natter and a chat, as we would call it. So there was none of this sort of, massive egotistical thing of don't come near me or don't approach me, or, I haven't got time for you. So, there was an incredible bond and affinity at a kind of grassroots level, I think, with all the players, because they just considered it an honour and a privilege to be playing for such a great club.
It's a very, very working class mentality and a very, very working class mindset that these people were brought up in.
Could I ask, Charlie, what was your father paid when he played for Belfast Celtic? Have you any idea what the wage would have been for him?
As I hear towards the end, the late 40s, I think you were talking something like £2 per week, which was probably, relevant to the time, quite a bit of money. But just to tap on something, I met a guy who played at Glasgow Celtic with my dad. He didn't really make the grade. He was from Belfast. He was a goalkeeper. He made a few appearances for Belfast Celtic, and he told me latterly, many years after my dad was dead, that he travelled on the tram to Parkhead with my dad to go to training, and between the two of them, they hadn't got the tram fare, and they had to hop off between stops.
My word.
It's changed days, isn't it?
So they weren't provided with any expenses whatsoever?
None whatsoever. Truthfully, no. And I mean, I had my dad's, 1955 original Glasgow Celtic contract signed by Jimmy McGrory and my dad, 12 guineas per week, £12, 12 shillings. And during the close season, as they called it, in other words, when the last match was played, there was no pay until the season started again.
Was he allowed to play for anybody else or do any kind of sporting activities in the close season?
Definitely not. Honestly not. No. So, all relevant to the year, I respect that. But what I'm saying is, they played for the love of it. Let's be frank.
Well, certainly I know, Rory, there would have been illegal football tournaments being played in Donegal off season, because I know that there were some players who were regularly going up to Donegal, assuming various names, playing in summer football tournaments in which there was a lot of money available for the teams that would win it, and those who came runners up. But maybe it was required because, as Charlie was just been saying, if you didn't earn anything when the season wasn't in progress, I mean, what were you to do? I mean,
exactly.
If you had a wife and family to look after.
Yeah.
You still had to put food on the table. And this is very much the time period that the club is going through its formative years when this is all kind of happening. And this is a brilliant backdrop for it. And I think it's a very good reminder that even though these people were incredibly talented and incredibly skillful to be playing for a top football team, they weren't exactly superstars and they were nowhere near rich.
No, but it would also have taken a lot of people, would say the foresight of businessmen like Frank's grandfather, who kind of saw that, this was something worth being involved with.
Well, yes, I mean, because ultimately the question is, how could you express your identity, which I think, Rory, you were hinting at earlier.
Yes.
You identify with a club and you identify with a community. And, if you're in a community that is somewhat of a minority, yes, there would have been money. Yes, there would have been a lot of hard work, but you wouldn't have been getting the best of jobs. Yes. And you wouldn't have been getting the career opportunities. I mean, that sadly was the lot of life of the Celtic supporters as opposed to the Linfield supporters.
Absolutely.
And the political links were interwoven. As I said a minute ago, the Unionist Party's history was a mirror of Parnell and the shock that they had with those two attempts at Home Rule. And the second one failed with Gladstone in the 1890s. And then, of course, as you move forward through to the turn of the millennium, and the Nationalist Party, which had been split, started a reform. And of course, an opportunity to assert one's right to life, right to liberty, all those iconic issues that are there. So what essentially happened was that, my grandfather, who was heavily involved in politics and business, the local newspaper, the Irish News as well, and a lifelong friend of his was a guy called Joe Devlin, who was the West Belfast MP very much a maverick. West Belfast has always thrown up maverick representatives historically.
Yes.
So we come to the third attempt at home rule. Essentially, this time it was going to become a reality because the Liberal government had a series of elections, having been faced down by the House of Lords. Home rule was never going to happen with the House of Lords. I mean, it was always a gesture with Gladstone because it got the House of Lords and the House of Lords would always block it. You come forward then 10 years later and the Liberal government's trying to give the working man things like social insurance, unemployment benefit, sickness benefit and all of those things, pensions. And the House of Lords weren't too keen on it because, of course, they were the employers as well. They owned the pits. They owned the industry. So they were blocking the government. So essentially there was a series of elections in order to get the king to agree to create more peers. Because that was the only way they could face down the House of Lords. And that happened. But in so doing, every time they had an election, the Liberals lost MPs. So they needed the Irish Nationalist Party support to get through their social policy. You won't be surprised, anybody's surprised to know, of course, that the price for being supported in that sphere, which of course was going to benefit the workers in Belfast and Dublin, we're all in the empire then, was also home rule. And so the Liberal government was pushing through home rule. It was on the statute book, and it wasn't a very popular move in Belfast. The minister in charge of the Admiralty decided to come over and explain to the workers in Belfast that actually home rule was a very good idea and they should support it. Curious choice of minister to come over. Of course, the minister of the Admiralty was a certain Winston Churchill, whose father had wound up the Unionists 25 odd years earlier, playing, as he famously said, the orange card. So the nub of this story is, of course, that the Liberal government had arranged for Churchill to come over. He was to speak in the citadel of unionism, the Ulster Hall, in favour of home rule. And the unionists suddenly thought this isn't such a nice idea, so they cancelled the booking and made sure that no other venue would be available to speak and hold a meeting. Unfortunately for the Unionists, a certain nationalist politician, Joe Devlin, had a friend, my grandfather, who was chairman of Belfast Celtic.
Okay.
So they arranged to get a marquee shipped over from Scotland, no less, biggest marquee ever produced in Ireland at the time, and they had the rally and the speech from Churchill at Celtic Park.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
So, as I say, you can't disentangle what happens in Northern Ireland right the way through the life, pretty much, of the life of the club.
What I quite like about it as well is that obviously when we tell these stories and Taryn supports a lot of the time with the same brush or with one particular label, but you can never do that. It's never a good idea to do that because football fans are fluid. The supporters of football clubs are fluid regardless of who that club stands for or what their perceived political leanings are. And it's good to remember that a lot of the Belfast Celtic support were actually unionists themselves, and it goes to show that it's good not to remember them as this nationalist and unionist divide, but actually just working class people who were enjoying a sport together as much as they still had their political opinions, and Belfast Celtic still stood for a particular sect of them. It's important to remember.
Yeah, and let me mention two of them, Stanley and Jackie Mahood, who were wingers. One played on the right, one played on the left. They had been employed by Linfield, but they were coaxed into joining Belfast Celtic, where they played for several years. But as a result of that, they couldn't get work at the shipyard. I mean, they wouldn't earn enough from full-time football, to keep going. They had to have a job as well, but they were kind of blacklisted from the shipyard. And I managed to speak with one of them. Now, to be honest, I can't remember if it was Stanley or if it was Jack. When I was, when I was writing the book, the Paradise Lost and Found book, I actually tracked down Stanley or Jack. I just can't remember now which one it was, but I mean, he was a very old man. He wasn't far off 100, and he was in a nursing home
I see.
in Bangor in County Down. But I managed to find him, and I had a brief word. So I mean, it was lovely just to, if you like, touch and make contact with this man who had played for Celtic in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, he was unionist to the core. But this was the club that had employed him, and he remained faithful to them right to the end, even though once he was past his sell by date as a player, they got rid of him.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's a shame because sometimes you can be as loyal as you like to a club, and that ends up happening. But sometimes you become part of its fabric and its story as well. And of the Mahood brothers, that very much seems to be the case, that they've written themselves into the Belfast Celtic story, and part of it is not primarily because of their beliefs, but because they chose to represent a club that a lot of people would pigeonhole them into actually representing their rivals. But as Frank alluded to, of course, all this political tension and turmoil was spilling over onto the terraces. And I suppose in the 20s is one of Belfast Celtic's first sort of flashpoints when the league was actually suspended because a lot of the troubles that were ongoing at the time.
Well, there's always argument about history, and it's always written by the winners. But the truth of it is that I think it was actually Bishop McCrory who went on to become Cardinal McCrory. He talked about the hostages and the to fortune of the Catholic minority in the north, and it was basically vicarious retaliation. If something happened during the War of Independence, a policeman or soldier was shot, retaliation took place in Belfast. So as the War of Independence became more intense, we saw the amount of violence on the streets in Belfast been visited upon the Catholic community. That, of course, intensified with the whole movement then towards the War of Independence post, the whole question of how do we resolve this and the treaty negotiations and all that followed. And there was a particular case of I think it's Terence McSweeney in Cork, the mayor. He was killed, and the district inspector in the town at the time was a guy called Swansea, and they moved him to Lisburn, which is just outside Belfast, and he was ultimately assassinated, I presume, by the IRB. It might have been at that stage. Anyway, all the Catholics were burnt out of Lisburn. All of that was visited on the community. So the football teams, of course, then became a target. I mean, there have been various concerns about matches and grounds being attacked, and it is obviously a concern when you get a crowd of people. But if you've got a crowd of people who are clearly drawn from one community, well, then it's a very easy target. So the two elements of it, Celtic withdrew from football for effectively nearly 5 years. I mean, we're playing a match against Cliftonville, another Belfast team, which ironically, 50 years later, became to be identified as the Catholic team. But going back to the 20s, the supporters weren't necessarily as broad-minded as that, and so there was an incident of shooting on the pitch, and so Celtic withdrew. And then the question is when do you come back? And how do you come back?
Yes, well, it's a tough question to ask, but we will get onto this very shortly. But when they did come back, I don't think anyone could have expected, after being away for 5 years, the run they would go on, and that's been likely.
Yeah, they came back in season 24-25. They had been away for 4 years, and the league had implored them to come back because, to be crude about it, football just went down the toilet, when they weren't there, because wherever Celtic went to play, they always brought a huge crowd with them. And, small clubs depended on the revenue that Celtic's supporters would bring to one of their matches. So when they were no longer in the league, just football suffered. The economics of it it wasn't working out. So the league implored them to come back. and eventually they agreed to it, and they came back in 1924. Their first match was had to go to Glenavon in Lurgan, which is about 30 miles from Belfast. And the railway company of the time didn't put on enough trains to cope with the numbers who wanted to go to the game. As soon as they returned, the crowds returned as well, and they just flourished. Now, in that first season back, they finished third. They were 10 points behind Glentoran, who won it. But then in season 25-26, they won it easily. They won it again in 26-27. They won it again 27-28. And believe it or not, they won it again 28-29.
4 in a row.
And I'm just looking at the stats here. I know, if it kind of gives you an idea. In those seasons which they won, they lost 6 league matches.
Incredible.
That is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And their goal tally, and we're just talking about the league, not any cup competitions. They came the first season back, they scored 36 goals. Second season back, 52, 66 goals, 101 goals, 116 league goals. And I mean, they were, if you were a Celtic supporter and you were going to see your team play, you knew you were going to get value for money in the results, and that's what they provided. They provided loads of entertainment.
They did. And it would have been a good time to be a Celtic supporter as well. But coming into the 30s now, Charlie, I suppose this is around the time where presumably your dad would have been going to watch Belfast Celtic before he started turning out for them.
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, with my dad born in 1924, so he would have signed as a 15-year-old 1939, but he would have watched them, before that. As I understand it, he was actually a ball boy at Celtic Park before he signed as a player. So, yeah, you're right. And as we enter into the 30s, and of course eventually get to 1935 with the appointment of Alicia Scott as second team coach initially, we're probably entering their most successful era and period.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a most successful period because during this time as well, they actually managed to go, I can't remember what season it was, Padraig, you'll probably be able to tell me, but they went something like 30 or 31 games unbeaten, or consecutive wins as well, with not even just unbeaten.
Something like that. Yeah, I mean, that was down to Scott. If you like, he was a really, really tough manager, kind of a cross. One imagines between Matt Busby and Alex Ferguson, who would not stand anybody questioning his authority. And when it came to being able to swear, he had no equal, apparently. And apparently it was part of his modus operandi when he was at the ground, when he was at Celtic Park. He would stand at the door of the dressing room in a manner that would really anger the visiting supporters. Although he came from a Presbyterian background, that didn't stop him wandering down the touchline, blessing himself when he got near to, say, the Linfield section. Now, this was all part of the games that were being played. Just the mind games. We're just winding people up.
As I understand it also, guys, we know he was a kind of strict disciplinarian within the club itself, but he also had, as I understand it, a kind of nucleus of spies who would go out on a Friday evening round the pubs and clubs to see if any of the players, probably Tully one in particular, was misbehaving the night before a game, so that they could report back and tell him, guess who I saw last night in such and such in the Rock Bar, for example.
Yeah.
He really was. He was a hard ticket was away.
I love stuff like that. It's great. And I'm guessing as well that he would have probably had a similar background to most of the players, because as you mentioned, two of them, Alex Ferguson and Busby, but also Shankly, the Shankly brothers and Jock Stein as well, all came from this industrial background, and it gave them this sort of workhorse mentality as a manager, where there were absolute no nonsense, but the players knew that they were buying into this almost socialist system of play when they would be playing their kind of football. And it's just it's a mindset that you don't really get with managers these days, because they don't come from these backgrounds where they've had to undergo such hardship to actually get there.
Yeah, the other thing is, I understand that whenever you signed for Belfast Celtic, particularly in the Scott era, you were told in no uncertain terms what that meant to you as an individual, the way you were to present yourself, to attend punctually training, to always remember that you were a Belfast Celtic player, so that wherever you went, whatever you did, whatever you said, had to personify the reputation of the club, and that you were never to forget you were a representative of it and privileged to be one. So that was ingrained in the like of my dad as a young lad, if you can imagine, and that that wouldn't have come kind of readily, if you understand me. Not then, anyway.
Can I just put a point in here too? Just something that occurs to me that there's a story, I think, in regard to Jock Stein. I think, is this a story that maybe has grown with the years, that he used to say, or it was said of him, that Rangers wouldn't sign a Catholic player, so he felt that he could sign anybody because he could have the best available, knowing that the opposition wouldn't get any of the good players who came from the Catholic community. In Belfast, Elisha Scott, who came from the Presbyterian community, he had been with the Boys Brigade as he grew up, and he played football for the Boys Brigade. So he had inroads to the Protestant community, which others wouldn't have had. So when it came to looking for players, he was able to call on his contacts and persuade people to join at Celtic Park. People like, I'm thinking of Joe Douglas would have been one, who came from part of the city called the Village, which is very close to Windsor Park in Belfast, an area where Elisha Scott grew up. Elisha had been connected with Linfield. Elisha's brother, Billy, had been the Linfield goalkeeper, the first team goalkeeper. He had transferred to Everton before Lish went off to Liverpool. So he had that entree into an area of the Belfast community that others wouldn't have had, and he was able to capitalize on it to maximum effect. So you had lots of players, and it isn't the case, Rory, of just kind of tokenism or identifying them as, they're Protestant players, and all of that. But nevertheless, he got people like Jimmy Jones, Jackie Denver, Harry Walker, Norman Kernahan played for them, Eddie McMorrin. These were people who were persuaded, that this was a club worth playing for, primarily because they paid a lot of money in comparison with other clubs. Jones, for instance, had been a Linfield player, and they didn't realise the man that they had. They didn't even play him enough. And he got fed up and said, I'm away here. And Lish Scott was made aware of this phenomenal footballer who was living in Lurgan. And he had another player who was at Celtic at the time called Johnny Denver, who happened to be a very close friend of Jimmy Jones. Denver had not been behaving himself, or he hadn't been maybe attending training, or he hadn't been as rigorous as he should have been in his preparation for matches. So Scott called him aside and he said, "Listen, you need to do for me something. I want you to have a word with that boy, Jimmy Jones. Bring him along with you. Do you hear what I'm saying? Etc., etc." And Scott also travelled down to Lurgan to watch Jones play, just to be sure that he was worth pursuing. And he saw him score all 6 goals in a match, playing for Shankill young boys. And Jones was not maybe the most graceful of footballers. He was like a battering ram. But nevertheless, Denver got him to come to Celtic Park. he and Scott had a word. White £5 notes were exchanged under the table, and he became a jewel for the time that he was there with Belfast Celtic. He didn't care, Scott, that is, he didn't care what religion anybody was. He wanted the best players playing for his team. Because, as an aside, in any transfer fee, he would have a say in the potential transfer of a player, and he was entitled to a percentage of any fee that went to the club. He got part of it.
I was just thinking of what Padraig was saying a little bit earlier, and the loss of Belfast Celtic when we withdrew. When we eventually left, it was the third occasion on which we left. We withdrew in 1911-12, in the 20s, and then lastly in 49. But you would know all too well in Glasgow of the income effect of the loss of Rangers when they dropped out. I mean, there was, it's like having the boat race without Oxford or Cambridge. It'd be,
yeah. No, you're spot on. You're spot on. Yep.
So I mean, the power of that, but the power of the pound, and of course, I do think, and I think Padraig might maybe add to this, is I suspect that the boards would have had their quiet encounters over a dram or two in the boardroom. Just as you were talking about Alicia Scott winding people up, there was a lot of sort of to and fro and unusual stories, and I think the story of the counterpart to Alicia in Linfield is one that's worth mentioning, isn't it, Padraig, the manager?
Oh, the manager, yes. Well, it was the secretary of Linfield who, on hearing that Jones had signed for Celtic, and Rory, it kind of gives you an idea of how people kind of tip the nod and the hat to people who were in authority back in those days. He was called to Linfield, to the secretary, who berated him. How dare he sign for the team across the other side of the city? And offensive language was used in describing the background. I don't wish to use it here, but I think you can figure it out yourself. But yes, but I mean that, and in many ways, I mean, I have to say, I got to know Jimmy Jones quite well. Certainly when I was researching the book, and I mean, he was a hard nut. He was a tough-speaking guy, but he said he took great offence at how the Linfield secretary described the people of Celtic, and Jones kicked over the table in the office, where they had their meeting, and he marched out, and he was never welcome back to Windsor Park after that. And in fact, that was this place where he had his leg broken in 1948. But even after his time at Celtic, when he did make that miraculous recovery and became a player again and played, maybe the best years of his life with Glenavon, where he scored the majority of his goals, there was nowhere better to score a goal in Jimmy Jones's mind than at Windsor Park. He just loved it. He really did, and in many ways you can't blame him given the way that he was treated. I suppose we can kind of look at it, some would say, through rose-tinted glasses. But the uniqueness that we feel about this club was that with somebody like Lish Scott at the helm, and he was in charge of the team, people like Frank's grandfather and the other businessmen who were the directors, they directed, they did the business side. Lish was in charge of the team. And they let him sign who he wanted, and he sold and bought as was required. But all he was interested in as a manager was, how good are you? You turn up on time, you don't misbehave, and when your days are over, we will sell you on. And that's the way it worked. There's a kind of a comic side to it, but his encounters with Charlie Tully are legendary, because Tully, I think it'd be fair to say, Charlie Jr., he was a bit averse to the whole business of training for football.
You know his famous quote about snooker players? He said, to be a great snooker player, you don't have to keep running around the table all day. That was his ethos on playing football. Why am I running around? I mean, Bernie all tells a great story about running around Celtic Park training, and he said your dad would do one lap and disappear into the dugout for about the next 10. And he reappeared for the last one, which is quite incredible. I think you see, my dad's ethos on that was, give me a ball and I'll train all day. But if you want me to run all day, sorry, that's just not what I'm about. I don't know if there was a degree of laziness or this was just the way he felt about it all, but you're quite right. His relationship with Lish was, to put it quite mildly, difficult at the best of times. You see, I think Lish, being the man he was, he refused to call my dad by his proper name. He called him Sonny, and that riled my dad because my dad was thinking, does he not know what my name is? But of course he did. So it was Sonny do this, Sonny do that, Sonny do the other. And then there's the very famous story after training where he lets everybody go and keeps my dad back and says to him, Sonny, you're not finished. So my dad's standing with him and he points down to this bucket of white paint and a brush and tells him to go up and paint the goalpost on the left at the park. And he goes and he does it and he brings it back and he says, right, boss, that's it done. He said, what's done? He said, no, you're not finished. He says, there's another goalpost down there or something. And he goes and paints it and he comes back. And you'll excuse the language, Rory. So he then says to him, so you painted both goalposts? You know where they are? Because you fucking didn't know where they were on Saturday. You didn't when I'll make it brief where he actually
fucking hell.
After a game like this, a couple of sitters, my granny could have scored that. So in the morning, Tully's name was struck out and somebody wrote Lish the Granny, which Lish did not appreciate.
That's absolutely incredible. Of course, around the time of 1944, a young 20-year-old made his debut for Belfast Celtic, Charles Patrick Tully. He would go on to be one of Belfast Celtic and indeed Glasgow Celtic's best ever players.
Well, I mean, speaking of Tully paintings of a sort, a few years back now at our museum in the Park Centre in Belfast, Rory, we had a visitor one day. We had visitors from all over the world, but there was this guy arrived in one day and he was Italian, but he was delighted. He was here. It was like he'd arrived in heaven. And we're saying, well, what's your interest in Belfast Celtic? I mean, are they known about in Italy? And he said, oh, yes. One of my heroes played for Belfast Celtic. And we said, who's that? And he took off his jacket, rolled up his shirt sleeve, and up the right arm, he had a tattoo of Charles Patrick Tully up his arm.
It's brilliant.
So there you go. But yeah, there was a name, and he wanted to visit the city where this player had been born and raised.
And he was part of what made Belfast Celtic's most important and most significant and trophy-laden years what it was, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, just to sort of conclude briefly on that, my dad was often asked, as you can well imagine, over his career, at the end of it, Charlie, what would your one wish be if we could give you a football wish? We could grant you something. Would it be to relive your 2 goals against England at Windsor Park? Would it be the 7-1 game? Would it be the trophy here, there and everywhere? And his answer was always the same. No, if I had one wish, it would be to see Belfast Celtic back in football. I would carry the kit bag just to be part of it. But ideally, I would be the manager.
There you go. I think that's testament to it as well because, of course, Charles Tully moved to Glasgow Celtic in 1948, 1949. But the reason for that wasn't just as simple as a transfer. It was because Belfast Celtic had actually chosen to withdraw from the league again. And it all kind of revolves around this incredibly fiery fixture on Boxing Day 1948, and after which they would never play another competitive game again.
Well, yes. Now, thankfully, Tully had already gone from Belfast before that incident. And one of the reasons he was signed by Glasgow was that they were interested in Jackie Vernon, the centre half, but Celtic were asking too much money for him. Belfast Celtic, that is. So they settled on Tully. And you know, when you talk about the power of a club and the lack of power of a player back then, I mean, Charlie arrived into work one morning to be told, "Go and pack your bag. You're heading for Glasgow," and he was on the boat that night, so he had little or no time to prepare for a new life. He had no agent representing him, you know, discussing the terms or whatever. And I suppose, in a way, if it hadn't been Jones, whose leg had been broken in that terrible game on Boxing Day 1948, then it could have been Tully, because the circumstances of the time were that Celtic were dominating football. Post-war, Linfield hadn't really done anything, and they were getting, very, very angry about it. And the circumstances of the match on Boxing Day, when Bob Bryson, the Linfield centre half, had his ankle broken in a clash with Jones. I mean, who's to say that that mightn't have happened as well? If Tully had been playing, it could have been him instead. And it could have been Tully who would be attacked at the end of the game. That didn't happen. Tully was already safely in Glasgow making a name for himself. But it was Jones who was attacked, had his leg badly broken when he was forced onto the terracing, and some thugs jumped him and broke his right leg. And that was the incident that provoked the directors into deciding they needed to take some serious action, because the authorities did little or nothing.
I was just going to say that, Padraig. It wasn't the incident that provoked the board. It was the fact that the IFA did Sweet FA.
Yes.
I mean, no fines, no points deduction, no ban, no playing in an empty ground, nothing.
They reversed the fixtures so that their home games were played away. And in a few weeks after that, they tried to get the decision overturned. But Frank's right, it was the inaction. There wasn't even an arrest. I mean, there was no kind of token, let's pick up a few people, question and whatever. That didn't happen. And even the asking of questions in the Parliament, that was frowned upon. But nothing happened, and the board took action. And Frank, I'll let you continue.
Well, basically, they didn't announce it, but they had arranged to sell off the players quietly. I think that's the one thing about it, really. You can't do things like that quietly, So essentially, they decided to withdraw from the league, and did. They had a swan song of a tour in the US, which I think you or Charlie might have pleasure in discussing what some of the matches there, but when they withdrew, they were very quickly replaced. So the IFA, I suspect, prepared the ground literally to move Crusaders in, and that was it. Third time of withdrawal, and they waved us goodbye.
Part of this as well is that Linfield lent into, I suppose, what was going on, and I think it's fair to say what was going on is that perhaps the IFA were looking for an excuse to replace Belfast Celtic, and a lot of the blame fell on the club for what happened, because Linfield came out and said it was actually Celtic fans who started this whole ruckus, which is perhaps one of those things that you'll never know, but at the same time, it's easy to see the picture of what was actually taking place here, and which was a very quick sweep this under the rug. We don't want these guys to be the ones that are the victims, and just, if they leave, we'll replace them. That's it.
Could I just say, because Padraig mentioned that the Linfield player's ankle was broken, my understanding was that the PA announcer called that out at half time, but his ankle wasn't actually broken.
Oh, it was
broken. But the fact that he announced it was the clincher for the crowd. You know, I mean, the queue in the casualty obviously wasn't as long as they are now, but to be able to get back and announce it to the crowd and inflame them.
Yeah, I mean, Bryson, the Linfield player, his ankle was broken, but it was an accidental clash
Yeah,
between the two. And ironically, he and Jones ended up, they were in the same ward in the hospital afterwards. And, there was no condemnation came from Linfield, whose chairman, funny enough, was a man called Harry Midgley, who was also the Home Secretary. I'm not sure if I mentioned that already, but Harry Midgley, yes, he was the chairman. But some of the Linfield supporters clubs were really angered by what happened and how their club had disgraced itself that day, and they certainly wanted to have no part in trying to cover this whole thing up. But as Frank mentioned, Celtic decided that the course of action to take really was to withdraw from the league because it had been a tactic that they'd used previously. It had worked very effectively, and but on this occasion, it didn't work for them again because the authorities brought in crusaders, and Celtic disappeared into the mist of time.
Yeah, that's the point, that the club effectively start winding down, I suppose. But they did go on a tour of North America. They obviously played Scotland as well in a kind of benefit friendly match, and they played Glasgow Celtic as well, of course. But they didn't really play competitively a game after that, and this is where the club effectively, sadly, ceases to exist.
Well, in 1952, and they played Celtic in a charity match in Belfast, although they weren't allowed to call themselves Belfast Celtic. They had to appear as, I think, the Newry Town Select. However, Charlie Tully played in that match.
He did. He captained the Celtic Select, correct, and Jackie Vernon captained the Belfast Celtic. It was a sellout crowd. I understand that they sang and chanted, "Will you no come back again?" To Belfast Celtic. So, the love that was never lost over the years, the intervening period. And you're quite right, the US tour, so 10 matches, won 6, drew 2, lost 2. And of course, the 29th of May 1949 beat Scotland, who I think were then the British champions of the time and era. 15,000 fans in the Tragically Stadium, New York, and most of the Scotland team at the time, I think, were the famous Rangers Iron Wall. And as I understand it, Scotland never ever played another provincial club in a friendly following that. I think quite simply they just couldn't accept being defeated by a Belfast Celtic.
And they did want to, or they tried to rearrange a second game between the two. Scotland wanted to play another match, but Celtic weren't having any of it. Another aspect of that match was both teams were staying in the same hotel. They travelled to the match and back from the match on the same bus. So can you imagine what the atmosphere was like? Probably going to the match, Scotland were probably, we'll win this easily. With these guys at the back of the bus, they'll be a pushover. And then on the return, I remember Johnny Denver saying to me that they were singing and yo-hoing at the back of the bus on the way back to the hotel, and there wasn't a peep from the Scotland. I mean, it was a huge embarrassment to them. I mean, a few weeks before they played that match against Belfast Celtic, I mean, they'd played a couple of games at Hampden Park, 130,000, 125,000, whatever it is, in a couple of matches. So, they were on a high. Very quickly, it came down to this disastrous result. Now, it may not have been the best game of football that was ever played, but you know what? Who remembers that? They just remember the result. And the fact that Belfast Celtic beat them that day was huge. And there was another point I would just tying in with Frank and Charlie have been saying about them, leaving and selling the players. There was always this unusual thing. Were they going to come back? When might they come back? I think they thought that they would come back. Give it a few seasons and they'll be begging us again, because Alicia Scott remained their manager,
That's amazing.
and they wouldn't allow him to join anybody else. Other clubs inquired about him becoming their manager. I think Glenavon was one of them. No, he wasn't allowed. I mean, what contract? I mean, what contract would he have been breaking? There wasn't one. All he was, in many ways, and it's not been disrespectful, I mean, he was a glorified gatekeeper. That's all he was doing, opening and checking the post, making sure that, everything was in order. For what? Some of the players that I remember talking to, one in particular, Harry Walker, said he was waiting for the call. Whenever the call came that we're back in business, he'd be the first one at training. They expected that there would be some kind of reversal of the decision, some method of getting them back in would have been discovered, but it never happened.
It sounds like he was there to uphold the institution of what the club was, and to be fair, considering the club left the league in 1948 and didn't officially, wind up as a football club until 1968, I think I'm right in saying.
Well, really, it was about 83 when the ground was sold. I was going to say that the ground itself was maintained immaculately, and I know hockey matches were played on it. Interprovincial hockey matches were actually played on the grass turf in the 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, Frank, why was that? Was it because there was the hope, maybe a quiet expectation that because junior internationals were played there, schoolboy internationals were played there, so it remained one of the most sought after venues in the city. And even, I'm sure, Charlie, you might intervene here because, I mean, your dad used to take you and some of your pals in there.
Yeah, every Sunday morning, yeah. My dad and he knew the caretaker, lived literally across the way in Rodney, where Paddy Bonner lived a few doors away. And we were in there every Sunday morning, kicking and playing about, 2, 3, 4 aside, whatever. And my dad was still trying to double his tricks, even though he was probably over the hill. But yeah, just fantastic to have been a part of it in that sense at that particular time. And you're quite right, as you ran out there and played and ran about with the ball and scored a goal or whatever, you just wondered what it would have been like to have it all back, a full house. Just an incredible dream.
Definitely. And I think this kind of leads us quite nicely onto this kind of aspect that we've covered in a lot of the episodes that we talk about, is that though a football club no longer exists, its memory very much carries on through the people who choose to preserve it, and therefore it's still alive in many ways. And Belfast Celtic is one of my favourite examples because it's one of the only examples of a football club which no longer exists and hasn't done for many years, but actually has a dedicated museum to it, which is fascinating. And this is where you guys really enter into the Belfast Celtic story and the ways that you've gone about preserving the memory. So this, kind of leads us quite nicely onto the work that you guys do. So I suppose just to start off, when did you guys first start getting involved in Belfast Celtic?
I suppose it was the early 2000s. I'd written the book on Paradise Lost and Found, the story of Belfast Celtic. In many ways, it was an important book to have first-hand accounts of what happened from those who were there. But off the back of that, the interest from it was such that people wanted to know a bit more about who was this club, where can we go and find out about them. So we have a very good friend in Norway, Eddie White, who originally comes from North Belfast. And it was he who was kind of got us interested in forming a society. And some of us got together in a way, and we discussed how might we keep the name alive? What could we do? And to that end, we began collecting bits and pieces of memorabilia associated with the club. Frank came on board because Frank actually was, am I right, Frank? You were the last kind of official secretary of the club?
Yeah, well, I was involved in the final, the club had been taken over by a local consortia who wanted to keep it going. It was a greyhound track and it was greyhound racing. It was a very substantial piece of real estate with the possibility of football never ruled out, but the troubles were so intense at the end of the 70s and 80s. You just would be inviting to make yourselves a target. But anyway, they certainly paid lip service to possibly at some stage coming back. But cut a long story short, around 1983, I succeeded my father as secretary. It was just a nice, it was a gratuitous gesture on their part to let the family still be linked with it. The business, they decided greyhound racing had no great future, so they sold it. It became a shopping centre, and I think the family that owned the company, the descendants of one of the businessmen, it became defunct, moribund company sometime in the early noughties. But when the ground was sold for a shopping centre, that really was the end.
And so Frank has been able to continue, if you like, the family connection through the work of the society, and that we're very much there for anyone who wants to come and see the museum. We have a little space there in which, well, it's a fairly big space, but we've managed to collect a lot of kind of original material, which of itself is of no great value, but it is the real thing, and it's a connection
Yes.
to those great days. You know, people come into the museum wanting to hear the stories of the club, the great matches, the great characters. And I mean, people just love it when Charlie Tully Jr. happens to be there.
Well, I was going to be saying, not that I'm saying we turn our guest this evening into an exhibition in the museum, but it must be fantastic for people to arrive and visit and see the son of one of Belfast Celtic's greatest ever players there. It's incredible.
I've got to be honest with you, it's incredible for me. Sometimes it's overwhelming. It's an incredible privilege to be involved with all these great guys, to be quite frank with you, because it's a real team effort. I just, every time I open up, to be quite honest with you, I just look up and I know that Charles Patrick's looking down on me.
But that's what's special about it as well, is that your dad's story within Belfast Celtic is as much yours as well, because you're preserving his life and his story through doing what you do, and that in itself is a magnificent act of preservation as well. And I can't think of a better example of football heritage being practiced than the Belfast Celtic Society.
We do a bit more than that, because we've had road shows where Padraig and Charlie will actually have interviews and recount and relate stories, and also bring some artifacts of the club. So we do that and try to preserve the history of the club and to reach a whole new audience, because I think it's fair to say the young ones are absolutely enthralled by what they hear, particularly listening to the stories that Charlie can regale them about their dad. And of course, the two Celtics that Charlie's dad had, I mean, the dual involvement is fantastic.
I mean, we understand, that it's maybe not that easy for people to come to the museum. We open whenever people ask us to. If people are in touch with us, we will always try to accommodate a visit, be it for one person or 10 people or 20 people. What we do, we do it completely as volunteers, and we will just share the story with whoever wants to come to the museum. But as Frank says, we will also go out to places if people want us to come and tell the story, because it remains a kind of a global story. At the moment, we're lucky in that we have a Danish film company have been working on a documentary about the club and the society, which will be streamed at some point next year. I mean, they've been working on it for 18 months or so. I suppose from our point of view, they were aware of the story. Bryn, the filmmaker, was kind of aware of the story, but I think as he has visited Belfast several times, he has really begun to understand what it is that we love about this club, even though we haven't seen any of the players ever play. But nevertheless, we understand what it stands for, what it has meant to the people of West Belfast. And so, we feel that whenever that goes to air, people around the world will know what the story is. And Charlie, you're going to be really busy over a period of time when more people start coming in their droves to have a look around the museum. At least that's what we hope.
Personally, obviously, I've got a kind of biased interest with my dad. That's understandable. But way beyond that, the great legacy that this club, these people, from the very start to the end has left us is completely and utterly priceless. Priceless, guys. Not just the memorabilia, not just the medals, the names, what it meant to these guys to play, to put the green and white hoop jersey on, to say, I'm a Belfast Celtic player, I played for whenever. That's just, honestly, I just think it's quite incredible.
It is. As I say, we are lucky in that we have a list of all the teams that represented, all the players who played for Celtic down the years, the results of their matches, who scored the goals for the most part. And I mean, that's a very valuable resource. So we're constantly getting queries from people who are saying, any chance you could look up whoever. My grandfather played for Celtic, in 1934. But Rory, I have to say to you that if everybody who claims that their uncle or granduncle played for Belfast Celtic, they would have had to have about 15 teams on the go all the time. But I think what it says is that there's an affection, there's a love, there's a belief in this team from the past, and that they have a connection.
And if it goes back to this idea of representation, then it's shown that people want their family history to be attached to this thing, which is ultimately, as much as a football club, it's also an idea and it's also an identity.
Absolutely. And and I suppose of the three of us, Charlie here, who comes from that side of the city, he perhaps more than the rest of us understands what it is to come from the west of the city, within a few hundred yards of this great club.
Yeah, but as a local lad, you can well imagine. I used to kick a ball in a back entry where I could hear the roars of the crowd at Windsor Park because I lived that close to basically what would have been Broadway and the divide, if you want to call it. So I can imagine what it would have been to have been a supporter of Belfast Celtic literally 2 streets away, and the number of people I've encountered over the years, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, mums and dads, who have said, my supported Belfast Celtic, my great-granddad wouldn't have missed a game or whatever, the adoration, the genuine love and affection is quite incredible. And of course, with that goes, sadly, the vacuum left that to this day we keep saying, guys, has never, ever been filled.
Definitely, no, it's absolutely incredible, an absolutely incredible club. And Belfast Celtic is the football history of Belfast first and foremost, but also social history, industrial history, working class history, political history. It's intertwined in all of these different things, and this is what is important about football, is that you'll always get people who say football and politics shouldn't mix, okay? And that's a debate for a completely different thing. If you believe that they shouldn't, then that's fair enough. But the fact of the matter is that they do, and that they always have done, and that you can't deny and you can't ever try and take away from. And this is where clubs like Belfast Celtic and other football teams come into it, is that they're intertwined in everything that is going on within the different contexts of their respective countries. But one thing I wanted to ask the three of you, what does Belfast Celtic mean to you?
Well, I think it's, as I say, when we had Celtic, we had everything is a well-known phrase, but it was a collective it was all about the community. And I mean, it's in our DNA. I mean, people go and see the likes of Taylor Swift or whatever and pay hundreds of pounds, whatever, and flights and hotels and all of these things for the shared experience of being part of a crowd and being part of listening to a song being sung about someone on the pitch or someone who used to be on the pitch. So the social dimension that is a very strong part of it. And I think we all identify with that, and which is why, clubs in the future that cease to pay any count or put any value on their fans will be the ones that will be in real trouble, because it's that intangible quality that makes a club exist, even when it no longer does, like Belfast Celtic. And what we want to do is try and preserve that little bit of that DNA and shared experience, sense of pride, that certainly people, they may have felt it, but there were a lot of other people in the society that was trying to prevent people having any pride or dignity and any sense of value.
Well, I think something that we're hoping to do as a society, Rory, is that maybe we will travel to Glasgow at some point to kind of share some of the stories of Belfast Celtic with an audience over there who might want to hear it. And if I could just mention briefly that about just over 10 years ago, I was involved with a project at Hampden Park. It was a memory project, the Football Memories Project. Well, I wrote a play then, which was performed in the dressing room at Hampden Park. And a lot of those who came along to see it, they were people who were maybe at early stages of dementia, late stages. But what struck me about it was how telling football stories brought light into their eyes. And the central character that I used for that play was Charles Patrick Tully. And there were people in that room who were convinced that they were on the touchline at Falkirk or Hamilton or wherever it happened to be, and they were watching Charlie Tully taking one of his famous corner kicks. So, I mean, that has kind of prompted me to get back to that project, and we're actually working on a longer version of it. But for me, there's an understanding of what football means to people of that generation when they had somebody as special as Tully lining out for them. And, it would be our hope that that's something that might happen in Glasgow as well, along with us being able to share the Belfast Celtic story with all of you over there. Because you know what? You guys might think you know how to play football in Glasgow, but when it comes to scoring goals, we taught you. We've taught you a thing or two. Isn't that right, Charlie Tully?
No doubt about it. I mean, just obviously what both of you have said, but it's a grand old thing to play for as well. Yeah, and you know that song was actually stolen from Belfast.
I didn't know that. No.
All right.
We'll make it quick. So, there was a British Army billet near Celtic Park on the Donegal Road, and on a Saturday, a band used to march down the back of it, playing this tune. Belfast Celtic fans decided, that's a great tune, we'll bring some lyrics to it. And in 1960, in Pye Studios, London, a certain gentleman was making a record, the Belfast Celtic song, Glenn Daly. And Glenn didn't realise when he went there that the song had to last for 2 minutes 20 seconds, because Glenn didn't have that. And he thought to himself during a break, when he was told to come back with a second verse, where the hell have I heard that song? And he phoned Charles Patrick and said, Johnny, what's the second verse of that song you sing that you brought from Belfast? So every time I hear that played at Parkhead, every game, every home game, that's our song. We're only letting that to you, right? But the society means just Personally, to me, honestly, everything in the world, everything. You know, it's an honour, it's a privilege, it's priceless. Do you know what? Belfast Celtic will go down in history, but the name will live forever.
And that's the important thing, and that's what's important about understanding what heritage is in football, because in this era of football, really the era that I've grown up in, everything happens so quickly. You know, it's football on steroids, managers who have come from the wealthiest backgrounds, players on £400,000 a week and all this kind of nonsense. And people don't understand that football didn't start in 1992. You know, people don't understand that before all of this happened and before everything really switched towards this really globalized version of football that we see today, football was a very, very working class thing. It was absolutely rooted in their communities, and every single football club had something that they could point to and say, this is what we stand for and what our fans believe in. And I think the Belfast story is important to just epitomising that as well. It's the perfect example.
Yep. And the other thing is, Rory, the reason why boat loads, plane loads, coach loads go from all parts of Ireland today to Celtic Park, all over Europe, following Glasgow Celtic, is because of the history and the events at Belfast Celtic. That's what triggered and started that. So we're a part of that as well.
We are. And, you know, we have had some great nights here in Belfast, Rory, with the Belfast Celtic Society. We have done events at Linfield, at Windsor Park, and they have been fantastic. And we have kind of opened the eyes of a lot of people. We've restored relations between Belfast Celtic and the Irish FA, and you know, we've had great support from the association, and one man in particular, Michael Boyd, who used to work for them, he helped us a lot, and it has done a lot just to kind of open the eyes of people who didn't know anything about Belfast Celtic, but they do know about them now, and you know, we feel that we've achieved something in that regard. And you know, like in football, there's great rivalry, of course there is, but there are also kind of great friendships have been formed down the years.
Guys, this has been an absolutely fantastic chat. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to come on and speak with me tonight. Is there anything that you would like to add just before we finish up for this evening?
All I would say, you know, thank you for the interest, and if it helps to tell our story, we can't ask for any more. And obviously, we will, accommodate anybody, anytime, as best we can.
Yeah, and I would absolutely urge any of our listeners, if you're ever in Belfast, to get in touch with the Belfast Celtic Society, go along and visit the museum, and leave them a healthy donation if your wallet allows it, so that they can continue the absolutely amazing work that they do. Of course, I'd like to thank all of our listeners for listening to this episode. There's been some really interesting conversations and dynamics that we've picked out of this on a really fascinating football club, and I hope you have all enjoyed it yourselves. Of course, if there's anything that you want to get in touch with us about to cover on our website or our podcast, you can DM us on X, that's @_footballheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. But for now, Padraig, say goodbye.
Bye-bye. Rory, thank you again for your interest.
All the very best, and thank you again, Rory.
Thank you for your interest. Really enjoyed it. Thank you again.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.